The One Piece card game is shockingly good. In 3 years, it's managed to become the 4th best-selling trading card game, right behind the 3 giants, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, and Magic the Gathering. It's even caught the attention of huge names like the DJ Steve Aoki and streamers like IShowSpeed and Moist Critical. Even the GOAT himself, Ichiro Oda, has jumped in on the hype. The One Piece TCG has even released an exclusive Dodger Luffy card bringing fans to the US from all over the world, which is now somehow worth almost $500. So if this is your first time hearing about the One Piece TCG, I'll be going over its explosion in popularity, some concerns about the longevity of the game, and end on some of my personal pros and cons with the game. Now, if you're already a One Piece fan, you'll likely be familiar with some of the color themes, like red decks having leaders like Luffy and Zoro are all about aggressive plays, or purple decks with leaders like Kaido or Charlotte Katakuri which focus on getting to the late game, and putting down huge characters like Charlotte Linlin or Gear 5 Luffy. It's also a very easy to learn TCG, and unlike other TCGs, One Piece has a consistent resource system, so you're rarely stuck with a bad hand. Another big reason the One Piece TCG is growing so fast is pricing, and looking at some of the decks that have topped recent tournaments, deck prices are a lot cheaper compared to other TCGs. One comment reading, "I dropped Yu-Gi-Oh! When I learned I could build 2 One Piece decks for the price of a Yu-Gi-Oh! Staple playset." Something else that really stood out to me is the community, and I don't know if this is One Piece specific or just the TCG scene in general, but I was honestly surprised by how positive and friendly everyone was. I myself have chopped it up in the Discord server, and it's amazing how for such a simple game, the dialogues between players are so in-depth. Each leader seems to have their own little ecosystem, with players theory crafting new strategies, helping out newcomers, posting their deck lists, and that kind of engaged, welcoming community is a huge deal, and one of the best signs for a TCG's long-term health. And before I get into my personal pros and cons with the game, I want to quickly touch on the competitive side of the One Piece TCG. If you're someone who loves competition or wants to become a top player, you'll definitely feel at home. And luckily, the prizing makes the grind more than worth it. And depending on your placement, the winnings can be seriously crazy. Like in 2023, when Jonas Abram won the first North American Nationals, who sold the winner card alone for over $45,000, and total prizing was estimated to be over $100,000. And this was just in 2023, and as the player base continues to grow, prize support is looking even crazier, which is a great sign for players looking for competition. And if you're a collector or just an art connoisseur, the One Piece TCG has some of the best art I've seen in trading card games. So it's no surprise we see alternate art cards going for such insane prices, especially as people try to collect their favorite characters. Now, before I talk about my pros and cons, let's talk about longevity. Some people worry that since the One Piece card game is based on a manga, it might eventually die off when the One Piece story ends. And while I don't have a crystal ball, I really don't see that happening anytime soon. The game's sales are exploding, the community is growing rapidly, and Bandai seems committed to the longevity of the One Piece TCG. They have already used art from the live action Netflix series, and there's potential to use cards from other video game spin-offs. And let's not forget, Wit Studios is literally reanimating the entire One Piece story, which is only going to bring in a whole new wave of fans and overall hype. So I think the TCG is here to stay for a while. Now let's talk about something every trading card game eventually faces, which is power creep. And because One Piece is built on a relatively simple core, there's less room to expand without making newer cards stronger than the older ones. And we've already seen signs of this with cards like Gecko Moria, which got banned, or more recently Gum Gum Giant, which should be banned. But the good news is, it seems like Bandai is taking steps to address this by introducing set rotations. This should help keep things balanced, but of course it's still early, so whether this actually solves the problem is something we'll have to watch as the game evolves. Alright, now let's finally dive into the pros and cons. And I'll start with the cons first. Right now, it feels like sets are dropping way too fast, and just when I get comfortable with the new meta, another set drops, and suddenly there's 6 new leaders and a bunch of new matchups to learn. Now, Bandai has confirmed that by 2026, Japan and the West will have simultaneous set releases, which might be why in the West it feels like everything is sped up, but honestly, I think the issue could have been avoided if they had just slowed down releases in the East to allow the West to catch up, because right now it feels like we're burning through content way too fast. If you're a hardcore player though, I'm sure the current pace is exciting, but for more casual players like me, it's starting to feel hard to keep up with the game. Another issue I've noticed is how each new set tends to feel like a passing of the torch to a new color. We saw it with Red and Whitebeard dominating a few sets until it eventually got banned, then there was Doflamingo, and now Purple has taken over the meta, getting cards like Gum Gum Giant and the new Akos Katakuri. And while the game's balance has definitely improved improved since launch, and admittedly the viable pool of competitive leaders has increased, some sets still feel like they revolve almost entirely around 1 or 2 leaders. It can get to the point where certain decks just can't compete. For example, I played Blackbeard, and during OP10 when Doflamingo was dominating the meta, I pretty much stopped playing for the entire set. And even if your deck was teched with cards specifically to beat Doflamingo, it was very much an uphill battle. So while there is variety, it feels like we're still in a state of few leaders being truly viable at higher levels of play, and colors taking turns dominating the format. And for my last con, which is probably the most frustrating for new players, is pricing on certain cards. While I mentioned most of the One Piece card game is actually pretty affordable, there are some cards that are just flat out overpriced. For example, this Luffy, which has recently become a staple in a lot of purple decks, shot up to $90 for a single copy, or Mr. 2, which was $78 at one point. And while Bandai has confirmed reprints for cards like these, dropping prices around the board significantly, most of these changes came very late. And these kinds of prices can be a huge turnoff for new players, especially if they're just getting into the game and aren't looking to drop a fortune. And as a side point, I wanted to mention with the Dodgers Luffy and collaboration card, I can see scalpers becoming an even bigger issue as the game continues to grow, and I just hope we don't end up with a Pokemon problem on our hands. Alright, now let's get into the pros. And one thing I really like is how Bandai's been experimenting with leader designs. Take Vegapunk for example, a 2-life leader with the ability to gain life every turn that can't attack, or the 3-life Luffy with 6,000 power. And if they keep innovating like this, I think we're in for some really unique and fun metas down the line. I also think the resource system is one of its strongest features. It actually reminds me of games like Hearthstone or Legends of Runeterra, both of which I played a ton of, so instantly felt familiar and easy to pick up. But what makes it really great is how flexible the Dawn system is. You can attach Dawn to power up characters, return it to your Dawn deck, or rest it to activate effects, giving you a ton of options and adds a lot of depth to the game. Another thing I really like about the game is how distinct the colors feel. Each one has its own theme and playstyle. Personally, I'm a big fan of gaining life and defensive decks, so I've mainly been playing black and yellow. But honestly, I think every color has something unique to offer, which I could probably make a whole other video on. That said, now that we're 3 years in, I have noticed a little bit of overlap creeping in. Some effects and mechanics are starting to blur between colors, but luckily it hasn't been too noticeable. And I doubt it'll ever happen, but if Bandai decides to ever introduce entirely new colors like white or pink, I think it would be a cool way to keep things fresh and exciting. And lastly, I think what the One Piece TCG gets right is the feeling of having control. And what I mean by this is that most TCGs, because it's a card game, there's always going to be a chance for a bad hand or say a bad matchup, where you feel like you had no chance to win from the start and nothing would have changed that. But in the One Piece TCG, it feels like you have a lot more control whether you win or lose. And in most games, you can pinpoint the moment you lost or something you could have done better, instead of feeling like the match was hopeless. So whether this is your first time hearing about the One Piece TCG or you're on edge about hopping in, I think now's the perfect time to start playing. And Bandai, for the love of God, please ban Gum Gum Giant.